Well, first of all, a warm welcome to the last in our series of free webinars. Everyone's been very fortunate to benefit from the IoD's generosity of these last 4.5 months. Thank you for joining us. And we're looking forward to 59 minutes of razor sharp corporate governance conversation. Just before we get started, please ensure that your microphone remains muted throughout and that your video feed is off unless you're a speaker. I'd like to just very briefly welcome former US Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley to today's webinar, and also British High Commissioner Stuart Gill, amongst other people. Please type any questions for our panel in the chat window, and I will put a selection of those questions to the panel towards the end of the session. Today we have a wise and experienced panel with Judge Professor Mervyn E, IoD Global Chair Charlotte Valeur, and HSBC Malta Chair Bonello, to take the temperature of corporate governance in Malta and to discuss issues such as integrated reporting, inclusive and sustainable capitalism, an outcomes-based approach to corporate governance, applying explain regimes, and the Malta Financial Services Authority's discussion paper containing proposals to update Malta's corporate governance framework, amongst a myriad of topics. Interestingly, under Judge Professor King's chairmanship, the King Committee on Corporate Governance has released 4 comprehensive reports and guidelines that endorse an integrated and inclusive approach to corporate governance, embracing stakeholders other than shareholders from as far back as 1994. So, welcome to our panel, and let's start with an easy question. The limited liability company has formed the basis of the modern economy, but you could argue it's outdated after 200 years. Is it still the right vehicle for entrepreneurial ambition? Shall we kick off with you, John?
Thank you, Edwin, and welcome to everybody. You said it's an easy question. I think it's anything but. And I think to be able to argue that the limited liability company is an outdated vehicle, I think one would have to offer an alternative, and I'm not sure that I know of alternatives that are suitable in Malta. Entrepreneurial activity, from the word go, will require capital, and that capital is usually provided by the entrepreneur, him or herself. The entrepreneur will start as soon as usually as a sole proprietor, but will probably do so to avoid the costs of incorporating a company, but would be taking the risk of not being able to legally distinguish between his business and his personal asset. As commercial activity increases, so will the need for capital. And as the need for capital increases, the issue of the limited or unlimited liability will quickly become more important. In the limited liability company, the liability of the owners of the company, whether it's the entrepreneur, operator, or external providers of capital, is limited to the extent of uncalled capital. Now, in Malta, our company law does provide for other commercial structures that involve the unlimited liability of the owners, or of a mixture of unlimited of some owners and limited liability of others. But rather than trying to examine which form of commercial entity best suits entrepreneurial activity, I would prefer to examine the extent to which the checks and balances that corporate governance set to provide applies to corporate activity irrespective of its form. The limited liability company in Malta is by far the preferred vehicle for commercial activity. And I don't see that changing in a hurry. It's governed by a legal and regulatory structure. And I think that our priorities in Malta should be focused on how to infuse good governance in companies where it is absolute. I start from a strong belief that commercial entities that are well governed are the ones that will build a successful and sustainable future. So perhaps it will come as no surprise that my view is, let's stick to what we've got and let's see how and where we can improve.
Charlotte, what's your thinking here?
Yeah, I have to say that I agree to a large extent. I do know that there is a lot more discussion around whether owners should take part of the liability to a higher degree than what we have now. Some of that sort of kind of started out with a discussion on stewardship code, which was an attempt to get owners to take more active interest in the companies that they were invested in. And I think that is something that's being explored in now the drive towards much more sort of broader social impact as opposed to just shareholder value. But I have to say, I would agree that fundamentally, the limited liability company is a very well-known and well-exercised one that I personally think works currently, maybe not in 10 years, but currently it's around how we handle ourselves within that legal structure. I completely agree with that.
There's something called a smart company, which is an entirely new form of business type, which combines limited liability with blockchain. And this being the blockchain island, I'm surprised that we haven't identified this new alternative. Mervyn, what's your view?
Well, my view
is a limited liability company still a valid vehicle?
Yes, I believe it is. I agree with Charlotte and John. It's not a question whether the limited liability company, having operated for some nearly 200 years, is the correct vehicle or not. It's a question of whether its leadership has acted correctly. The company itself is an incapacitated artificial person that has no mind, no heart, no soul, and no conscience. So when something goes wrong, it's a question of its corporate leaders have made a wrong business judgment call or have gone rogue. And that has an impact, of course, on the reputation of the company. So society turns its wrath against the company. And I gave a talk several years ago, which was broadcast in Australia, that the company, when you think about it, is always innocent. When something goes wrong and there's a corporate scandal or a corporate collapse, the fault lies at the door of its corporate leaders, because it's their decisions that cause the collapse or cause the company being seen to be not a good corporate citizen. But so the methodology of an unlimited liability organization resulted in wealthy people not granting capital to those entities because they were still on bankruptcy liable to creditors and to employees. And to attract the continuation of capital, the government of the day, namely the government of the UK and followed in Massachusetts in America, decided to create an artificial person which had limited liability. So the wealthy people would grant £10,000 per share, let's say, whatever it was, and that would be the limit of the liability. The concomitant of that was, on bankruptcy, they'd go at the back of the queue to creditors and employees, etc., suppliers. So it has worked, but the question is, it's not the company itself that is being questioned, in my judgment. It's the question of the conduct and the thinking of its corporate leaders. Throughout the 20th century, the thinking was a financial capital model underpinned by the primacy of the shareholder. The consequence was that we had a century of unsustainable development. resulting in ecological overshoot into the 21st century, which means that companies were using natural assets faster than nature was regenerating them, clearly not a sustainable matter. None of that was the fault of the limited liability company. It was the fault of directors following the dictate of Milton Friedman, that the sole purpose of the company was to make profit and increase making profit without deception, even if that profit was being subsidized by society and the environment, which it was during the 20th century into the 21st century. So the legal structure and the company architecture, I believe, should be sustained.
We'll maybe just pick up from this idea of ecological overshoot. The USA Roundtable pretty much made headlines around the world last year with a very significant reframing of corporate purpose. Has the purpose of business changed? John?
I had a look at that. I don't think it's changed. Perhaps it is evolved. As I understand it, the USA Business Roundtable had always put shareholder primacy at the forefront of its principles of corporate governance. Yeah, and in August last year, it issued a statement on the purpose of a corporation. In that statement, the Business Roundtable recognized that each individual company serves its own corporate purpose, but that purpose is in turn best served by a commitment to delivering value to customers, investing in employees, dealing fairly and ethically with suppliers, supporting the communities in which the companies operate, and generating long-term value to the shareholders who provide the capital that allows companies to invest, grow, and innovate. Now, frankly, I don't see anything in that list that does not appear in other expressions of good corporate governance. If I quote directly from the guide on board effectiveness issued by the UK the FRC in the UK in July 18, it says the quality of governance will be evident by the way the company conducts its business, for example, how it treats its workforce, customers, and suppliers. So really, that's the direction. What's missing in that list that I just read out, and what is rapidly shooting up any agenda, is the importance of companies to consider the effect of its actions on the environment. Ironically, perhaps one of the benefits that this world pandemic we are still experiencing is that it has brought to the fore discussion on the effects of climate change and the effect of different behaviors on the environment. We are going to be seeing more of this, I believe.
Charlotte, I suspect you might have a slightly different answer here. Has the purpose of business changed, or is it in the process of changing, or do you see it in 5 years' time a totally different animal to the one that it is now?
So the conversations around it has changed. So to a degree, I'm still agreeing with John. If you really look at it, so one thing is words and another thing is actions. So are we still pampering to the shareholders only? I mean, even the UK Companies Act 172 says you have to be knowing what impact it has on the environment and the community. So the whole broader social impact on this is an environmental impact has already been there for years, decades. We just haven't really lived by it. We are having discussions at board level now in the FTSEs because that's part of the code to define our purpose, which we didn't do before in quite the same way. Now it actually has to be properly defined and written up in the annual report. And I think that's a good step towards, it's the next step from a viability statement, but a good step towards directors and managers really considering why do we exist? Why do we exist beyond putting money in the pocket of shareholders? And I think what I see is younger entrepreneurial companies start off more and more so as a social impact organizations, and that they exist for social impact, and that the sort of social enterprises are definitely growing very rapidly, and that impact investing is also growing rapidly. So if there is no clear purpose and impact, positive impact on environment communities, they will start losing investors and interest from the people that they want to attract interest from. So I think purpose is changing. I think we have a good way to go, unfortunately, but we're on the right path.
Mervyn, that's 1 for and 1 against. Well, can you, as a former judge, tip the scales?
Well, I think the last bastion of the mindset of the primacy of the equity holder was the United States of America. And eventually, IFAC, International Federation of Accountants, which is housed in America, but of course operates globally, started talking about value creation and spoke about that. I was right in saying that to call an accountant today a chief financial officer is a misnomer, because accountants today who get into that position are not dealing only with the financials. They're dealing with the whole value creation process and looking at the IR model. They're dealing with resources, which we say are 6 capitals, so that they should rather be called chief value officers. And what has happened with the roundtable announcement is that they say the purpose should be redefined. But the purpose of certainly the limited liability company and businesses adopting that as the medium through which to conduct business has always been to benefit society. So the question should have always been asked, not how much money has the company made, and the criteria for success under the Milton Friedman doctrine and the judgments of various courts at the time was increased dividends, increased profits, and increased share price. If you had those 3 criteria achieved, it was a successful company. No matter how you arrived at it, today the critical issue is, how has the company made its money? And if it's made its money with adverse impacts on the environment, then how strategically and in the company's business plan has it planned to eradicate or ameliorate those negative impacts? Is it going to be a true value creator for society, or is it going to be practicing a business where there's value, maybe preservation, but could be value erosion? And so the Business Roundtable has actually said that the company's purpose is to act in the interests of all the stakeholders. What concerns me is that the mindset might shift. The era of corporate leaders in the 20th century was to focus on increasing the wealth of shareholders. I would hate to see an era in the 21st century where directors focus on the interests of all the stakeholders and forget that they have to make decisions in the best long-term interests of the health of the company. And in the nature of things, there'll always be trade-offs between the stakeholders. There will never, I think, be a decision made in the interest of the company, which will result in the interests of all the stakeholders. There'll always be trade-offs. I think the best example today is trying to change a fossil fuel-driven plant and machinery by a company, because long-term they need to change to renewables to have that sustainable value creation. Well, if the board decides that over the next 3 years they're not going to pay dividends to the shareholders to save 500,000 euros a year, let's say, and use that cash flow rather to change from fossil to renewables, to drive the plant and machinery rather than disturbing the debt equity ratio. That's a decision in the best long-term interest of the health of the company, because that's where companies have got to go to. But there's a trade-off. Here the shareholders look to be suffering. But it's very interesting, some companies who have done it, their share prices on the various stock exchanges in the EU have gone up, because some great asset managers said, here's a board that's actually applied its mind to the long-term health of the company, which longer term is in the long-term better interest of all the stakeholders. I'd hate the roundtable statement to be seen that directors must make the error of the 21st century of acting always in the interests of stakeholders. That would be a form of socialism and not a form of capitalism, and not, certainly not inclusive capitalism, which connotes that you're acting in the best interest of the company, but taking account of the interests of all the stakeholders, but making decisions. Obviously, you're going to result in trade-offs between those stakeholders benefiting one more than the other. So there is a red light in the roundtable's decision, and yet hidden away is a statement there: this mustn't change the American way of life, and that is capitalism.
John, you've been outgunned. It's 2-1. Social impact and benefiting society have trumped. John, how should boards be thinking about corporate governance in this changed world?
Yeah, I'm not sure we were saying totally different things in the last question, but
No.
Talking about corporate governance in this change world, I'm going to limit myself to trying to focus on the local, and to deal with that question in the context of Malta. My first observation, which I made earlier, is that even in a small market like Malta, in my experience, the best governed companies are the most sustainable and successful ones. Now looking at the landscape in Malta, we have currently 3 MFSA sets of rules. The Code of Principles of Good Corporate Governance that are an appendix to our listing rules. There's a Corporate Governance Guidelines for Public Interest Companies, and a Corporate Governance Manual for Directors of Investment Services, Investment Company and Collective Investment Schemes. Interesting. I'm interested with the definition of public interest companies, which include government-owned entities incorporated as limited liability companies, but do not include private companies. Now, there may be developments internationally which head towards the direction of starting to draw in private companies. The guidelines that exist at the moment are similar to the ones that would prevail in the UK. They deal with the board, the duties of directors, board meetings, and so on, relations with shareholders, conflicts of interest, pretty standard stuff. But in February of this year, the MFSA published, which you referred to earlier, Edwin, a discussion paper on a revised governance framework for authorized entities and listed entities. I understand that the consultation process around this framework is complete, and the publication of a new framework is imminent. It's interesting to note that the new framework seeks to build on the existing rules and not replace them. So, for example, the guidelines for public interest companies will still be there. And this is interesting because my guess is that the direction of travel will lead to larger private entities being drawn into the definition of public interest companies. We must recognize, however, that there is locally still a fairly widespread view that corporate governance is relevant only to listed entities. The belief tends to be that in private companies still shareholder privacy takes priority over other considerations. I don't think that there is yet a broad acceptance that corporate governance is a mindset more than a set of rules, where often these rules are seen to be a distraction from commercial priorities or commercial activity. I think that many boards of private companies still need to accept in today's world consideration must also be given to the broader range of stakeholders. The boards of many private companies still need to be convinced that the purpose of their company is better served by recognizing that it is more about more than about the immediate interests of the shareholder. This said, in the local context, we also have other challenges and other limitations which we have to overcome. Central to any corporate governance structure is the independent non-executive director. I think we have to recognize that in a small country like ours, the pool from which we draw NEDs is not a very deep one. In a society where everyone knows everyone else, the challenges of finding truly independent directors and avoiding conflicts of interest are somehow magnified. Now, these challenges can only be overcome by increasing awareness. And in this respect, what the IoD is doing here with their Chartered Director program will be a major benefit, will prove to be a major benefit. Education and thought leadership initiatives of the larger accounting firms, the law firms, are also proving to be a catalyst for change. What's also interesting is that the MFSA is also gearing up, I understand, to provide a comprehensive set of education and awareness initiatives. So attitudes will change. Coming back to your original question, how should boards be thinking about corporate governance in Malta? I don't think the task is particularly daunting. In my experience, listed entities in Malta, by and large, apply high levels of compliance to our principles of good corporate governance. It's just a question of extending the application of those principles to a wider constituency. And I am confident that this will happen in time.
I saw a smile of satisfaction there, Charlotte. You did great things last year, helping us to get Chartered Director up and running. And it's certainly having some social impact already. So well done on that one. We've heard from John about this idea of extending the application of these principles to a wider group. How do you see that happening yourself, particularly in a small place like Malta or where you are working from in Jersey?
So, so this is the same issue we have in Jersey. Jersey, we have just over 100,000 people. We have a large amount of companies registered here, as many of these international financial jurisdictions have. One way that I tried to help this was by launching Board Apprentice 7 years ago, which is basically asking the board to take a part of developing future board members by reserving a seat at the table for observation. So you can get someone coming for a year, observing the board at work, like an apprentice would observe the masters as work if you want, for individuals that are otherwise fully board ready. So they understand corporate governance, they understand accounts, the high-level basic for accounts, and they understand strategic thinking. So they are board ready in that sense, but they need to just experience what actually goes on a board. With that, if you get, let's say, 100 boards in a row, you can develop 100 people a year if each of them take 2 at the same time, which I had on several of my boards. So on the Blackstone board I chair, for example, we had 2 people at the same time. We had a lady from Beijing actually coming over to the board meetings throughout the year. And then we had a Jersey lady as well that was joining us. On the other, Kendi Wilson I was chairing, we had two people as well from Jersey that we developed as board members, and all of the ones, or just over 70%, become board members. It is totally possible to do that, but we have to work together. It is not one, it's not the regulator's job, or it's not this person, it's all of us together. And this is where the whole feeling of we are a country, and in this country we want to take maximum advantage of all the talent we have in all the different age groups, in different socioeconomic levels, in different ethnicities, different genders, in all the areas. We want to use all our talents, because when we don't do it, we lose competitiveness, and it's kind of crazy not to. There's no business rationale for not ensuring that we get all that talent. The rationale I see, unfortunately, is often more self-serving nature. It's people who like to have, you know, a number of directorships and they don't like to share because it's a privilege to have reached that stage. And when you start picking at people's privileges, they don't get so happy. So sometimes you get barriers put up so that the competition doesn't get too big. I mean, I have many men telling me that they feel that now, as a white man, they can't get any board positions, which is completely untrue, because the fact is they still get 80% of the available positions. So if that 20% going somewhere else is feeling quite threatening, I'm fearful of what will happen when we reach a 50-50.
Mervyn, if we look at sustainability, as you mentioned before, it's about investing for the future and not about share buybacks and dividends. Why aren't we getting this right yet?
Well, I think the we is correct, because the we connotes individuality, individual persons, real live human beings. As I said earlier on, the company is an incapacitated person that cannot operate without its directors, without its leaders, its corporate leaders. The era of corporate leaders in the 20th century, the latter half of the 19th and 20th century, was to focus on the wealth of shareholders. And as I said earlier, the era must not happen in the 21st century of acting in the best interests of all stakeholders, because that would be not acting in the best interests of the company. So the reverse has to happen, from acting to increase the wealth of shareholders. Directors have to focus, which was always their duty, common law duty and statutory, even though if one looks at section 172, it's supposed enlightened shareholder approach in the United Kingdom. The common law in the United Kingdom and the thrust of even the New Companies Act was directors' duties to act in the best long-term interest of the company. And if you get that right, it's in the best long-term interest of all the stakeholders, including the shareholders. The critical thing was believing to increase the wealth of shareholders. And what happened over the last 100 years, investigation and expedited research with the computer age, has shown that share buybacks and dividends have effectively increased the wealth of the company back to shareholders from 10% of value created to 70% of value created. Now, that money should have been retained by the company and hopefully could have been employed by the company to improve the long-term health of the company. So the answer to your question is having conscious corporate leaders that are absolutely aware that they themselves are the conscience of the company, and the company will not be seen to be a good corporate citizen, creating value for society, holistically speaking. So the critical question the director should be asking is, how's the company made its money? And that's why you need a mindful, outcomes-based governance paradigm in which to operate. It cannot continue being a mindless checklist, which has become a grudge compliance, and correctly so, because it adds no value. But it does add value to business judgment calls being made by that collective mind of the board. If you look at what are the outcomes, how does this decision impact on one of the critical outcomes of value creation in a sustainable manner? If it's impacting adversely, think again, board. Think again about your decision. It's obviously not going to end up being a value creator for the society, and that's the purpose of the company.
We're going to visit a topic now which I think a lot of people on this call today are going to be fascinated with how you guys approach this. Maltese financial practitioners are rather unhappy about Moneyval and a potential grey listing of the jurisdiction. Does this show that corporate governance hasn't permeated properly in the economic system. John?
Moneyval has been and is about the governance of our national financial system more than about the governance of corporations within that system. It's common knowledge that our jurisdiction failed in some important aspects of a recent Moneyval inspection, and we have been given until October of this year to rectify a number of identified shortcomings. This is a very tight deadline, but it is clear that the Maltese authorities are taking this very seriously, and a great deal of work is being done to deal with these shortcomings. We are assured through public official statements that the corrective action that is being taken will be sufficient to ensure that Malta does not find itself on a FATF grey list. I'm obviously not privy to the details, and I can only assume and have to work on the basis that the public statements are correct. That said, I also feel that the negative result of the jurisdiction in the Moneyval inspection must also be a reflection to some extent on the corporate and financial sectors of our economy. Obviously, there are outstanding examples of well-governed, compliant entities in the commercial sectors, in the financial sector, in the professions, but it is equally obvious that there are others in those sectors that have fallen short. The consequences of our jurisdiction not meeting the October deadline are serious. Everybody acknowledges that, and we remain encouraged by the confidence of the authorities that we will be okay. But the crux is that it must not stop there. The new processes and structures that are being set up to fight financial crime must be truly effective and must lead to serious investigations, prosecutions, and consequences. The last thing we would want is a failure in subsequent Moneyval inspections.
Charlotte, you were here last year and you met a very broad spectrum of different stakeholders, private sector entities, listed companies, SMEs. You met some pretty large cap public sector entities. You met people from the political class. What was your impression of our corporate governance when you visited?
So my impression when I was there last week, speaking to a large range of people, as you've just laid out, is that there's a real will and want to learn more about corporate governance, to lift the barriers away and come up to a slightly higher level of operating, although without any shadow of doubt, many organizations are already operating at a good enough level, right? But it's the willingness to continue, because even in the UK, we need to have that willingness. It's you can always do better. You can always do better no matter what. When I arrived in Jersey 15 years ago, there was grave concerns that the Jersey regulator, for example, was too strict and demanding too much. And I kept saying, you shouldn't be afraid of having some stricter regulation, because it puts you in a competitive advantage with where the world is going. 15 years ago, that was not acknowledged, and people were still pushing for less regulation, and I was sort of speaking the other way and not being super popular in some circles. 10 years ago, even then, people were like, oh, it's all too hard work, it's too hard work. At that stage, I was on the board of a BT pension fund, which was set in Jersey. They would never have been in Jersey as one of the largest, if not the largest pension fund in the UK, had it not been for the environment of regulation and proper corporate governance. And that's the kind of thing that a country needs to make a decision on. And especially the small countries can do that using sort of a bit more peer governance and ask many people, what is it, what business is it we want to attract? What kind of companies do we want to have here? So Jersey has about 100 London Stock Exchange listed companies as well, for example, last time I looked. And they can be here because they know they have the service providers, the directors, and the environment that is good enough for them to be supported within Jersey to be able to hold a listed company. And I think that's what for Malta as well. What is the vision for Malta? Where is it you want to take? Where is you want to take the country? Do you want to attract, like, you want a much bigger piece of gaming? You're already doing pretty well there. As soon as you go into sort of the publicly listed space, you need to have the service providers, and you need to have, like, you know, a few of them. So there's choices to make, 2 to 4 on each, you know, administrators, lawyers, big banks, whatever. These are decisions that I think the country needs to make and then stand behind, or decide, actually, we don't want that. We're happy with more entrepreneurial, with the venture capital, with the things that are smaller and not demanding the same level. So I think you're not in a bad position. You're moving in the right direction with everything, and you're interested. There's a group of people interested in doing this, but you have to ensure that if you want to attract business that demands that you can service it in all the key aspects of what those businesses will need.
Mervyn, a potential grey listing of the jurisdiction is sailing pretty close to the wind, isn't it?
Well, Moneyval, cutting through the verbiage, is actually looking at financial criminal conduct, such as money laundering. And if one analyzes the value of companies today, the market capitalization, research has shown since 1997 that the so-called non-financial assets, chief amongst that is the reputation of the company, is one of the company's biggest assets, and only the latest research shows only about 15% of the makeup of market caps of companies around the world are additives in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards, be it US GAAP or IFRS. The rest of these so-called non-financial assets. So directors as corporate leaders who are acting, for example, and tolerating money laundering through their company, is actually playing with the value of the company and is not discharging his or her duty of care to the company. And so I come back to the issue. A conscious corporate leader would not be a party to the company being a money launderer and Moneyval looking at it through a microscope. So again, it's a question, if you have mindful outcomes-based governance, and one of the critical outcomes is there trust and confidence in the community of that company in which it operates. Does this company in Malta have the trust and confidence of the people of Malta? Or is it a company that is seen bordering on a lack of legitimacy of operations? And if it is, you're impacting on 80% of market cap of a company. And that director is not discharging his or her duties to the company. So again, I come back to the question, governance which is mindful and outcomes-based starts addressing issues such as this. But Moneyval is actually looking at financial irregularities such as money laundering. And a company that's doing that is actually playing with the value of the company and is not discharging his or her duty to the company.
Okay, well, I think we certainly the word mindful, using this connotation of mindful, that there is mindfulness in the criminality. Some commentators are arguing that corporate governance itself is just another set of buzzwords, and that companies are constantly going wrong. Volkswagen, Carillion, Sports Direct, Deutsche Bank, the list is almost endless. Boards are behaving badly, and corporate governance hasn't corrected that. Some companies are directed and controlled by criminals. So don't we need more robust penalties and sanctions to stop this abuse, Charlotte?
It's I mean, this is something that's discussed quite widely in sort of governance, not only governance circles, but it's clearly an issue. We have had too many situations where it seems that the boards have not done what they were supposed to do in terms of oversight of the business. Generally, I don't think the boards were criminals, but I think maybe there has been a few, but generally they have not had sufficient eyes on the right things and asked the right kind of questions. We can increase penalties, but actually in principle, directors are already fairly penalized in that they have the full personal liability on the line. So everything we have is on the line. And in addition, if you're on a listed company, you're required to also have skin in the game through having stock in the company. So I think in terms of what are the ultimate risks, the directors is at quite a high risk as it is. What I think is lacking is maybe that full understanding of actually when are you trading in such a way that that liability will hit you. And then maybe it is that it hasn't been pursued strongly enough by the courts. But we have to also bear in mind then that if we then lose anyone wanting to even be a director, that's also an issue. So it's a real fine balance between where you put the blame and the liability and everything, and how you make everything properly accountable. I mean, we're trying to rejig the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council in the UK, into AGA, a new institution that should deal with things slightly differently. And some people are calling for like the governance being separated from the accounts, because accounts is law and governance is soft. But from my point of view, those two things are really very stuck together. So all the words in the front end of accounts is stuck into the back end. I mean, Mervyn was touching on trust, and I think this is where we should be looking a little more into trust. So if you look at the sort of trust equation, which is credibility, reliability, and sort of intimacy or confidentiality divided by self-orientation, self-orientation being self-interest. The more self-interest you have, the more it erodes the reliability and the credibility of the people you want to have trust in. Directors should take very seriously their role in getting the public to have trust in directors and therefore trust in business. And I don't feel that that's something directors are taking seriously enough. And if you want to develop trust, you have to follow certain ethical, guidelines to do the right thing. And if we get more people understanding that the values they lead by is a key component of developing trust in society, which is a key component of people being happier as well overall in society. The more trust you have, it's directly correlated with how happy your people are. So I think that's something, absolutely to Mervyn's point, trust is something we need to look at and develop more. And if you do want to develop more trust, that should come with a desire to also do proper corporate governance with everything you do. And I think I heard from a great chairman, he said to me, corporate governance is really the music in the background. It just makes everything work well. And that's right. It's not a box ticking exercise, but it has to sometimes start like that. But once it works, you don't even talk about it. It just sits there as a framework around what you do and makes you do the right thing. It really is very, very nice when it works well. We just need more people to see that.
We've taken a very nice journey in this conversation to the point where basically we're going to address what Mervyn has described as 80% of the value, which is in reputation. Why does corporate governance sit at the center of the success or failure of Malta's economic system? John?
We just mentioned Moneyval. What Moneyval, I think, has taught us is that it's not enough to have the right legislation in place. There must be the will and the structures and effective action to keep bad actors out of our economic activity. I think nobody can argue that against the fact that the only beneficiaries of crime are the criminals themselves. But we must also recognize and be realistic and recognize that it's not only the authorities that are responsible to keep bad actors out. At least as responsible are the economic operators themselves, be they banks, be they professionals, or the directors of the operating companies. Corporate governance, I believe, when it has woven itself into the fabric of our economy, will be critical because it engenders, to take Charlotte's point, it engenders the right behaviors. And these behaviors are the ones that will ultimately be the foundation of profitable and sustainable activity.
Mervyn, what's your view on the centrality of corporate governance to the success or failure of the economic system?
Well, if it's a mindless checklist approach to governance, it adds no value. It becomes a grudge compliance, and there's plenty of evidence to substantiate what I've said. One needs to approach it on a basis that it is mindful, that the board actually applies its mind to a business judgment call it's about to make, and asks the question, how is that going to impact on the critical outcomes which stakeholders look at, and then make a judgment call as to whether the company is or is not a good corporate citizen of Malta. So it has to be mindful and has to be outcomes-based. Corporate reporting has moved from just the financial statements, which was historic and became incomprehensible to not over 95% of stakeholders, to financial reports and now sustainability reports, which is now placed under what is known as the ESG cluster, environmental, social, and governance cluster. But these things have become very complicated. The financial report is absolutely incomprehensible to 99% of stakeholders. So A, it's historic, B, it's incomprehensible, and the basic premise of accountability is to be understandable. On the other hand, sustainability reporting, there's a plethora of information which is coming into companies through the net. Directors have to sift through that, what is relevant and pertinent to the business of the company. Knowledge is being lost in information. And directors have to make sure they're getting the correct knowledge and they telling people, their stakeholders, reporting to the company, through the company to all its stakeholders. What are the material matters defined as that which is having an impact on the three critical dimensions for sustainable development, the economy, society, and the environment? All three have to be taken into account. Now, if you get that mindful outcomes-based governance, because your question is, why is corporate governance at the center of the success or failure of Maltese economic system? The critical question should be asked, what sort of governance are you talking about? If it's a mindless checklist approach, then the providers of capital in the capital markets of the world today, in looking at a bond issued by a large Maltese company in the capital markets, do not do only a financial due diligence, they're doing ESG due diligences. And to do an ESG due diligence in a company or in the country where you've just got a set of rules of governance which to follow the language that Charlotte uses, a tick box exercise. But to do an audit of the quality of governance where you've actually had a mindful outcomes-based governance, now you've got a quality kind of audit. And if you take companies like BlackRock, I mean, Larry Fink has said in his latest letter to CEOs in the EU and in America, we want to know the value creation process. And is it going to be sustainable? And we need to know that before we go and invest $1 of the $7.3 trillion we have at our disposal in the equity of a company. So, for example, BlackRock will not invest in a Maltese company. That is just providing a mindless checklist and saying we've got a nominations committee, we've got an audit committee, etc. We've got independent non-executive directors because they're not a shareholder, they're not a supplier, they're not. These are critical bystander tests. The critical issue is mental capacity. Is that director intellectually honest and acting in the best interest of the company and putting aside present needs and past experiences? and actually making decisions, taking account, learning and understanding the interests of all stakeholders, realizing there's going to be a trade-off, but making that decision for the long-term health of the company. If you get that right, then it's at the center of success of the Maltese economic system. If you don't, well, then you might have Moneyval and other people ticking other boxes.
Charlotte, the IoD stands for integrity and enterprise. And on the integrity front, we tended to focus mostly on corporate governance in terms of both awareness and education. So do you feel that this is, are we promoting a mindless form of governance?
I don't think we are. I think we are promoting the right things that can help, the tools that can help directors discharge. So there's 7 core director duties, and that's really the tools that we need to be able to discharge. That's the 7 things that we need to look at in terms of duties for directors to fulfill. And to do that in the appropriate manner, we have to understand how to do it. So what I feel with corporate governance is often, so you will read a code and it says, oh, directors should have oversight of risk management, for example. So it's like, we go, yes, okay. What is kind of missing, I feel, is the practical application of that. What does that look like? How do you do that? How do you know you have the right assurances? How do you look at your internal controls? Well, how do you decide whether you should even have internal controls and why you should have them? So my focus has always been this very practical application of corporate governance, not so much learning the code and this, but you have to kind of start with understanding the basics of the principles of governance. But the next step behind that is very much, what are these practical steps to actually do it? When I started serving on boards 15 years ago, I mean, that was a steep learning curve because it was very different from being an investment banker. So again, principles you have to follow and make sure you do the right thing would be the same. But I think what the IoD leading integrity, for me, integrity is what you have when you hold on to your values, right? So integrity for me in its own is not a value. It's what you have when you follow your values, and it's what you lose when you don't. So I think if we hold on to those principles, that we would aim to have integrity in everything we do, because we do everything with the right values behind and with the right mindset, then we'll be okay. It's always when it starts going the other way. And actually, historically, I have seen from own experience, when things go wrong, that's where a good framework of corporate governance really help you to sort it out in a cleaner way. It's when you then have to start thinking, did we do any risk oversight? Did we do this? Did we do that? Then it's too late, right? Once the brown stuff hits the fan, that's not the time to look at, have you done the right thing? You do the right thing before that happens and you will be okay.
The prevention is always better than the cure. Okay, well, we're nearly out of time. I'd like to ask our panelists one final question, and please keep your answers succinct because we're really out of time. We'll start with John, followed by Mervyn, and we'll end with you, Charlotte. The question is this: if there's one thing that you'd like the audience to remember about what you said today, what is it? John?
Look, in my experience, the most successful and sustainable companies are those that aim to achieve their purpose by applying a culture, and I fully accept that that does not mean a checklist, that recognizes that today's stakeholders in any business are more than just the shareholders. A company that does not recognize its customers, suppliers, its people, and its environment as key stakeholders will not be a sustainable business in the longer term. In short, it's the better governed companies, irrespective of size, that will be the more successful.
Mervyn, what would you like us to remember about what you said today?
Well, I'd like people to remember that directors are individual persons who owe their duties of good faith, care, skill, and diligence to the company. not to any stakeholder, particularly not the shareholder, but they need to learn and understand the needs, interests, and expectations of their various stakeholders and deal with them fairly in making that judgment call in the long-term interest of the health of the company. Because if they get that right, it's in the long-term better interest of all the stakeholders. Of necessity, there are going to be trade-offs between the various stakeholder interests. But that's the true practice of governance, to making sure the long-term health of the company. Will it be sustainable in pension funds in Malta when the bulk of the money has to be paid out, let's say, actuarially in 25 years' time? Will it still be around creating value? That's really the test. And you can only do that with directors acting with intellectual honesty. They have to cross that Rubicon from interests, from greed, from arrogance, from pride, all the corporate sins that are operating on the minds of individuals. And fear as well, making a decision. Could I be sued for making the wrong business judgment call? And that's why we have the judgment rule to protect directors today. And cross that Rubicon into that space of intellectual honesty, leaving aside present needs and past experiences and just acting in the best interest of this incapacitated person that's dependent on the director, my heart, mind, soul, and conscience-wise.
Charlotte, we'll leave the last word for you.
I will be very quick. Know the 7 duties of a director and lead with values. That's my advice.
There was a very good piece by Dr. Roger Barker on the 7 duties.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can share that with all our attendees.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's all we have time for. So thanks to our panelists, Judge Professor Mervyn King, IoD Global Chair Charlotte Valeur, John Bonello, HSBC Malta Chair. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today. And thanks to all of you in the audience for being with us. The recording of today's webinar will be made available on IoD Malta's social media pages, hopefully in time for the weekend. So that will give you a bit of fun going back over some of the very insightful discussion that we've heard today. So check out our Facebook and LinkedIn pages for the link, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good
afternoon. Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
John, thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Mervyn.
Thank you very much, Mervyn.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Charlotte. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.